After 4 years on the sidelines, Austria sought another war with France to avenge its recent defeats. Austria could not count on Russian support because the latter was at war with Britain, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire in 1809. Frederick William of Prussia initially promised to help the Austrians but reneged before conflict began. A report from the Austrian finance minister suggested that the treasury would run out of money by the middle of 1809 if the large army that the Austrians had formed since the Third Coalition remained mobilized. Although Archduke Charles warned that the Austrians were not ready for another showdown with Napoleon, a stance that landed him in the so-called peace party. He did not want to see the army demobilized either. On the 8th of February 1809, the advocates for war finally succeeded when the imperial government secretly decided on another confrontation against the French. In the early morning of the 10th of April, leading elements of the Austrian army crossed the Inn River and invaded Bavaria. The early Austrian attacks surprised the French. Napoleon himself was still in Paris when he heard about the invasion. He arrived at Donauwörth on the 17th to find the Grande Armée in a dangerous position, with its two wings separated by 120 km, 75 mil, and joined by a thin cordon of Bavarian troops. Charles pressed the left wing of the French army and hurled his men towards the three corps of Marshal Davout. In response, Napoleon came up with a plan to cut off the Austrians in the celebrated Landshut maneuver. He realigned the axis of his army and marched his soldiers towards the town of Eckmühl. The French scored a convincing win in the resulting Battle of Eckmühl, forcing Charles to withdraw his forces over the Danube and into Bohemia. On the 13th of May, Vienna fell for the second time in 4 years. Although the war continued since most of the Austrian army had survived the initial engagements in southern Germany. On the 21st of May, the French made their first major effort to cross the Danube, precipitating the Battle of Aspern-Essling. The battle was characterized by a vicious back-and-forth struggle for the two villages of Aspern and Essling, the focal points of the French bridgehead. A sustained Austrian artillery bombardment eventually convinced Napoleon to withdraw his forces back onto Lobau Island. Both sides inflicted about 23,000 casualties on each other. It was the first defeat Napoleon suffered in a major set-piece battle, and it caused excitement throughout many parts of Europe because it proved that he could be beaten on the battlefield. After the setback at Aspern-Essling, Napoleon took more than 6 weeks in planning and preparing for contingencies before he made another attempt at crossing the Danube. From the 30th of June to the early days of July, the French recrossed the Danube in strength, with more than 180,000 troops marching across the Marchfeld towards the Austrians. Charles received the French with 150,000 of his own men. In the ensuing Battle of Wagram, which also lasted 2 days, Napoleon commanded his forces in what was the largest battle of his career up until then. Napoleon finished off the battle with a concentrated central thrust that punctured a hole in the Austrian army and forced Charles to retreat. Austrian losses were very heavy, reaching well over 40,000 casualties. The French were too exhausted to pursue the Austrians immediately, but Napoleon eventually caught up with Charles at Zeheim, and the latter signed an armistice on 12 July. In the Kingdom of Holland, the British launched the Walcheren campaign to open up a second front in the war and to relieve the pressure on the Austrians. The British army only landed at Walcheren on the 30th of July, by which point the Austrians had already been defeated. The Walcheren campaign was characterized by little fighting but heavy casualties thanks to the popularly dubbed Walcheren fever. Over 4,000 British troops were lost in a bungled campaign, and the rest withdrew in December 1809. The main strategic result from the campaign became the delayed political settlement between the French and the Austrians. Emperor Francis waited to see how the British performed in their theatre before entering into negotiations with Napoleon. Once it became apparent the British were going nowhere, the Austrians agreed to peace talks. The resulting Treaty of Schondrun in October 1809 was the harshest that France had imposed on Austria in recent memory. Metternich and Archduke Charles had the preservation of the Habsburg Empire as their fundamental goal, and to this end, they succeeded by making Napoleon seek more modest goals in return for promises of friendship between the two powers. While most of the hereditary lands remained a part of the Habsburg realm, France received Carinthia, Carniola, and the Adriatic ports, while Galicia was given to the Poles and the Salzburg area of the Tyrol went to the Bavarians. Austria lost over 3 million subjects, about one-fifth of her total population. As a result of these territorial changes, Napoleon turned his focus to domestic affairs after the war. Empress Josephine had still not given birth to a child from Napoleon, who became worried about the future of his empire following his death. Desperate for a legitimate heir, Napoleon divorced Josephine on the 10th of January 1810 and started looking for a new wife, hoping to cement the recent alliance with Austria through a family connection. Napoleon married the 18-year-old Archduchess Marie Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis II. On the 20th of March 1811, Marie Louise gave birth to a baby boy, whom Napoleon made heir apparent and bestowed the title of King of Rome. His son never actually ruled the empire, but given his brief titular rule and cousin Louis Napoleon's subsequent naming himself Napoleon III. Historians often refer to him as Napoleon II.